reason why religion is such a great argument to be having is that it is our first attempt at making sense. I mean, religion is what you get before philosophy. It's our first attempt at philosophy. Most philosophers started off as religious, as did many ethicists. It's our first attempt at cosmology, first attempt at healthcare, by means of miracle, alas, but still. And prayer. It's our first attempt to make sense. And science doesn't completely replace all those questions, but it says that there's no need for a supernatural attempt to answer them. In other words, if you say, because we don't know what the scientific origins of the Big Bang are, which Father Lemaitre didn't know any more than I do, or Einstein did, there must be a supernatural explanation. That isn't logical at all. And if there was a supernatural progenitor, where did that supernatural progenitor come from? Who created that? So you get nothing out of it but an infinite regression, and I think the meanest application to science is more satisfying than that, and much more likely to yield an answer that you can at least argue about. Whereas if you're simply told you have a creator and he has a plan for you, it explains nothing, and it has reactionary implications, because it suggests there are people who can't just tell you what to do. There are plenty of those as it is. People who say, God tells me to tell you what to do. And that's slavery.
You make this point yourself, don't you, about this infinite regression of creators. And in fact, Aristotle concluded that the logic of all of this would necessitate 47 or 55 gods.
Yes.
What's the mathematics?
I have no idea. There's a lot about Aristotle I don't understand. And some of it's in that song that
yes.
From Woolloomooloo?
Well, I think it was actually the University of Woolloomooloo. Yes.
Woolloomooloo, so I knew I was pronouncing it. Yeah,
yes.
It is.
Aristotle was a bugger for the bottle.
Yeah, Plato, yes. Never mind. John Stuart Mill, of his own free will, on half a pint of shandy, got spectacularly ill. But Plato, they say, could stick it away. Half a crate of whiskey every day. And of course Aristotle was a bugger for the bottle. Thomas Hobbes was a slave to his dram, and René Descartes was pissed as a fart. I drink, therefore I am.
Okay. If my wife was
How the hell did that happen?
Yeah, I don't really know.
Yes, Socrates himself is particularly missed. Lovely little thinker, but bugger when he's pissed.
There's something about the raising of the wrist.
There's nothing Nietzsche couldn't teach you about the raising of the wrist.
Yes, okay. Let's get serious.
Immanuel Kant was a real pissant. Very seldom stable. Martin Heidegger was a boozy beggar. He could think you under the table. David Hume could out-consume. Schopenhauer and Hegel.
Hegel, yes, there you go.
And Wittgenstein was a boozy swine who was just as sloshed as Schlegel. I think that's all they wrote.
As you can see, Christopher's widely read.
If you're going to be a serious grown-up person and appear to defend the Catholic Church in public in front of an educated and literate audience, you simply have to start by making a great number of heartfelt apologies and requests for contrition and forgiveness. Now, you might ask, His Holiness on that occasion, it was March the 12th, 2000, if you wish to look it up, begged forgiveness for, among some other things, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of the Jewish people, injustice towards women, that's half the human race right there, and the forced conversion of indigenous peoples, especially in South America. And that followed a whole series of preceding apologies, or apologies, I would say, of a kind, made by the late Pope John Paul, who, it troubles me not at all to say, was a very impressive and serious human being. It followed no less than 94, count them, public recognitions on his part of appalling crime and error and cruelty and stupidity and offences to the free intelligence. Joseph Ratzinger, the current Pope, considered by some, by Catholics, to be the Vicar of Christ on earth, says of Indians, of the Indians who were massacred in the course of conversion in Brazil, after the apology had been made to them, He said, nonetheless, it must be remembered that before we came to convert them, they were silently awaiting the arrival of the church. I don't think that's a very genuine kind of apology to you. In his comment, one of the few he's made, on the institutionalization of rape and torture and maltreatment of children in Catholic institutions, he has said, it's a very severe crisis which involves us, he said, in the following: in the need for applying to these victims the most loving pastoral care. Well, I'm sorry, they've already had that. And to say that this is the responsibility laid upon you by the horrific admission that you've already had to make is not accepting responsibility in any adult sense. When I say child abuse was institutional, how dare I say so? How can I prove it? How can I prove such a thing? Well, I'll ask His Grace, and I'll ask Anne Widdecombe. Where is Cardinal Bernard Law now? Where is he? Where is the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, whose resignation was indignantly demanded, finally, by 50 members of the Church and by the whole laity of Massachusetts, who also demanded his prosecution for the promotion and protection and covering up and apology for and defense of people whose crimes against children are too revolting to specify. And he's not in the jurisdiction of Massachusetts now, as perhaps you know. He's the Supreme Vicar of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, personally appointed by the Pope to that as well as many other important sinecures. And in 2005, this man, a fugitive from justice and from complicity in the filthiest crime that it's possible for a human being to imagine, was one of those voting in conclave to decide who the next Vicar of Christ on earth will be. I think it will one day be admitted with shame that it might have been in error to say that AIDS is bad as a disease, very bad, but not quite as bad as condoms are bad, or not as immoral in the same way. I say it in the presence of His Grace, and I say it to his face. The preachings of his church are responsible for the death and suffering and misery of millions of his brother and sister Africans, and he should apologize for it. He should show some shame. Fourth, for condemning my friend Stephen Fry for his nature, for saying you couldn't be a member of our church. You're born in sin. There's a revolting piece of casuistry that's sometimes offered on this point. Yeah, we hate the sin only. We love the sinner. Stephen is, I'm sorry to say, not quite like other girls. It's his nature. Actually, he is like other girls in that he's, when I last checked, absolutely boy mad. He's not being condemned for what he does, he's being condemned for what he is. You're a child made in the image of God. Oh no, you're not. You're a faggot. And you can't join your church and you can't go to heaven. This is disgraceful, it's inhuman, it's obscene, and it comes from a clutch of hysterical, sinister virgins who've already betrayed their charge in the children of their own church. For shame, for shame. And finally, under this Pope, as if it wasn't bad enough to try and restore the Latin Mass to gratify the mad fascistic followers of Archbishop Lefebvre, but to begin again to offer remission of sin, as Bishop Ratzinger, the Pope, I'll call him the Pope for heaven's sake, wants to do. If you come to a Catholic youth festival in Sydney, Australia, where I just was, you'll get a certain remission from purgatory or hell. It may be temporary. If you come a lot and you give a lot, you'll get possibly permanent remission from the eternal punishment that they don't know any more about than you and I do. This is the sale of indulgences blatantly, openly. It's the same temptation that was offered to those who set off on that fourth crusade that's just been apologized for, and killed all the Jews of Europe on their way, sacked Byzantine Christianity when they got to Constantinople, and then went on to massacre the Arabs and Muslims. They were offered paradise if they died committing these terrible crimes against humanity. But if you see what I mean, therefore, the stimulus to crime, the impetus to crime, the belief in certainty, the belief that a divine warrant entitles you to do whatever you like, is the sin that must be cancelled, that must be annealed, that must somehow be apologized for. Now, I don't wish any, that's perfect timing. I don't wish any ill on any fellow primate or mammal of mine, even if this primate or mammal claims to be a primate in possession of a secret that's denied to me. I can forgive even that because I live in a country where their reign doesn't run, their writ doesn't apply, and they can't burn me and silence me and censor me any more than they can tell my wife that she can't use contraception, or any more than they can really tell Stephen that he's a beast. So I don't at all look forward to the death of Joseph Ratzinger, I don't. Or any other pope, not really. Except for one tiny reason which I ought to confess and share with you. When he dies, there's quite a long interval till the conclave can meet. Maybe Cardinal Law will still be on it to pick another pope. Sometimes it goes on for months till they get the white smoke. And for that whole time, that whole interval, it's a delicious, lucid interlude, there isn't anyone on earth who claims to be infallible. Isn't that nice? All I want to propose in closing is this, that if the human species is to rise to the full height that's demanded by its dignity and by its intelligence, we must all of us move to a state of affairs where that condition is permanent. And I think we should get on with it. Okay, thank you for having me. Apart from that, Abraham's most famous for saying, if God wants me to kill my boy, of course I will. And the only difference between the monotheisms is that some say it was Isaac and some say it was Ishmael. I don't particularly care. But there are annual festivities on the part of the faithful to say, we wish we too were capable of such faith. And we want to beat our breasts in sympathy with those who are. Why do the Jewish people blow the ram's horn, the shofar? Because the shofar symbolizes the ram who is sacrificed instead. The blood sacrifice is the main thing. And there has to be a child involved. This seems to me to be disgraceful. And what's taken for granted that goes with it, because it was practiced on Isaac too in the form of a covenant and imitated by others, the genital mutilation of the young, to seal the pact with God, to say, nothing matters to me, not the life or health or bodily integrity of my child, never mind that. What has to be proved is, without God I am nothing. I'll kill for it, and I'm not just willing to say that, I'm willing to prove it, and I'm willing to use my children's bodies as the theatre of this enactment of faith. Well, civilization, in my submission, ladies and gentlemen, begins where that evil nonsense leaves off. And we have to advance the time when more and more people will be able to civilize themselves by outgrowing religion and leaving this awful nonsense behind. And with that,
there was a serious motion before the United Nations that saying anything critical of Islam would be criminalized. And that's the end of free speech, and it's very dangerous. But perhaps you want to comment on that, because I think you're probably much more astute observer of it than I am.
The United Nations non-binding, so far non-binding resolution, which is carried now for 3 years, and was carried again this week, sponsored by Pakistan, a country for which we pay. It isn't really even a country, barely even a state. It's a construct of Muslim partitionism carved out of the body of India. It wants to tell us what we can say and what we can think in our own country. And it says that we mustn't ever use the word Islam in any sentence that includes the words violation of human rights, for example. Now this is in the week when the government of Pakistan has handed over to the Taliban its most fertile valley, this valley of Swat, 100 miles from the capital, Islamabad, and said, you can run this valley, militarily and legally. You can have Sharia law, and you are the police and the enforcers of it. And you can close all the girls' schools. But we can't say that your religion is anything to do with the violation of human rights. It's preposterous. Resist it while you still can, and before the right to complain is taken away from you, which will be the next thing. You will be told you can't complain because you're Islamophobic. The term is already being introduced into the culture, as if it was an accusation of race hatred, for example, or bigotry, whereas it's only the objection to the preachings of a very extreme and absolutist religion. Watch out for these symptoms. They are not just symptoms of surrender, very often ecumenically offered to you by men of God in other robes, Christian and Jewish and smarmy ecumenical. These are the ones who will hold open the gates for the barbarians. The barbarians never take a city till someone holds the gates open for them. And it's your own preachers who will do it for you, and your own multicultural authorities who will do it for you. Resist it while you can. And if you wonder what will happen if you don't, look and see how a cricket team in Middlesex in England had to change its name by force last week, because it was called, and had been for years, the Middlesex Crusaders. Look and see how stories about little pigs can't be taught to children in English schools anymore, lest offense be taken by the religion of peace.
Did you ever, as a young man or a boy, actually have any religious faith?
I'm terrified that someone here might have bought my book and have read my answer to that question. If you haven't, by the way, it's available at fine bookstores. I never did. I think a lot of people have the same experience as me. I wasn't maltreated by any faith or any church or anything like that. I didn't have a reverse Damascus of losing my faith. What I did was more like discover that I didn't believe. I think probably there are a fair number of people here who know what I'm talking about, who had the same experience. The way I discovered it was this. I had a nice teacher called Mrs. Watts, an old trout. When I was at a boys' school in Devonshire, I must have been about 10. And she was our nature teacher, nature walks. Come on, boys, show you different kinds of tree, flower. I used to know the difference. Bird, that sort of thing. But she was also our scripture teacher. I used to enjoy scripture lessons because it was my first, I didn't know this, but it was my first work as a literary critic. I was going through. One day Mrs. Watts made a fatal mistake, and she tried to combine her scripture teaching with her nature teaching. And she said, swept away by faith, she said, and boys, you notice how beautiful the greenery is. The trees, the fields, the shrubs, the leaves, they're lovely shades of green, which she said is amazing because it's the color that's the most restful and lovely to our eyes. So God must be very good, because imagine if he'd made the leaves and the grass orange or purple or something really clashing and horrible to the eyes. But he didn't. He made it green, which is much nicer. And I thought, I was 10, I thought, that's bullshit. I didn't know anything about chlorophyll, say, then. And I could never get over it. I started to notice more and more discrepancies and absurdities. And you know how it is, you can't be a little bit heretical. That's partly why I favor compulsory religious instruction in schools. Because I know of no other way to guarantee the steady mass production of atheism among the young. But at least there was one thing you could say. Nobody said, well, why don't we give them what they want, the boss? Why don't we just surrender? Why don't we look for the root causes of their grievance? There was at least none of that bullshit. And there won't be any of that bullshit anywhere where I can raise my voice either. Say it once, so not to have to say it again. You do not deal yourself a hand in the conduct or formation of British foreign or defence policy by putting a bomb on a bus in Tavistock Square. You do not. Final. Do I have to say it twice? No. Will I listen to anyone who says that we should? I certainly will not. I certainly will not. And nor should anyone else. And the Prime Minister will not do so. And what people ought to realise is that there is indeed a connection between this and the Iraq War. The same people did this at King's Cross and Edgware Road and Aldgate last week, who last Friday blew up 24 school children in Baghdad. Yes, of course there's a connection. We're fighting the same people. And they will rue the day. We will outlive and outkill and outfight them. They say they prefer death to life. Maybe they do. If they want to be martyrs, we're here to help. But our love, really here to help, but our love for London will outlive their hatred and their love for death, believe me.
Hear,
no question about that.
Hear, hear.
Sorry, I just jumped like a pea on a hot shovel because I'd meant to say this when you said about Stephen calling himself an agnostic. I would have been if I'd been around, and I still am, a great admirer of Thomas Huxley, the man who is I think, uncle of Aldous and Julian, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. He had the great debate on Darwin at the Natural History Museum in Oxford with Bishop Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam to his parishioners, who was a descendant of the great William. And Huxley creamed him on that occasion, as everyone remembers. It was a walkover for our team. And so we're all very grateful to Thomas Huxley, but I can't thank him for his coinage of the term agnostic, which was his bolt-hole term. Again, to try for a compromise where I don't really think the basis for it exists. So you don't have to say you don't believe in God. You can simply say not all the returns, not all the evidence are or is in yet, so I won't declare. Now, I think that that's wrong twice. One, you're not saying that you cannot prove that there is no God. No atheist has ever said that. There is a scientist in America called Victor Stenger, who's produced a book called God, the Failed Hypothesis, who goes as far now as to say science can definitively say there isn't. But I think that's a very adventurous position. But the atheist view is there's absolutely no reason ever been advanced by another primate to believe that there is one. And when you've got that far, you really ought to say there isn't, it seems to me. Not that for that reason I'm not sure. And it's completely not on all fours with the other position, which is evidence has nothing to do with it. Faith is much more important. Not only should you have faith, but you'll be saved if you do. Now, that's not, I don't know. It's not, there might be. It's not, unless you do it like Pascal and say it's a vulgar bet, it's a wager, what have you got to lose? Which I think is morally creepy, as well as evidentially unsound. Because if some huckster comes to me and says, look, he may not be there, but if he is, you've got everything to gain by saying you believe in him, even if you don't really, I'll say, well, then I don't think much of your God, because if there is such a person, and I spend my life arguing that there isn't, and I do my best, when I check out, which I sure will, if I find that I'm mistaken and I'm confronted with the guy, I would hope he would be able to say, I at least admire your honesty.
I don't know what an encore is in this environment. Perhaps he could just sing one verse. One more verse.
Well, I could do it straight through.
Go ahead.
Of the boozed-out philosophers.
Yes.
Of Wally Malou Philosophy Department. Ladies and Bruces. It's Eric Idle's great performance at the Hollywood Bowl. It's a real honor to be SK. Oh, Immanuel Kant was a real pissant who was very seldom stable. Martin Heidegger was a boozy beggar. He could think you under the table. David Hume could outconsume Schopenhauer and Hegel. And Wittgenstein was a beery swine. Wittgenstein was a beery swine who was just as sloshed as Schlegel. There's nothing Nietzsche couldn't teach her about the raising of the wrist. Socrates himself was permanently pissed. John Stuart Mill, of his own free will, on half a pint of shandy got spectacularly ill. But Plato, they say, could stick it away. Half a crate of whiskey every day. Aristotle was a bugger for the bottle. Thomas Hobbes was a slave to his dram, and René Descartes was pissed as a fart. I drink, therefore I am. Yes, Socrates himself is particularly missed. A lovely little thinker, a lovely little thinker, lovely little thinker, but a bugger when he's pissed.